So this story has a happy ending, so we're going to start there. I love what I do. I love my job. I get to make science exhibits for kids. But I do it at a place here in Chicago, the Museum of Science and Industry. And I have a PhD in physics, so I trained as a physics researcher. But I really, in addition to identifying as a scientist, I am also a storyteller. So I'm going to tell you my story, but to understand it, you kind of have to understand what an exhibit developer is. So we all go to museums, but no one ever stops to think someone has to make the stuff that's there. So when you go to a museum, anything that's bolted to the floor, anything you touch, you read, you see on a screen, all of that has to be made by an exhibit developer. So we engage at the museum, we engage people in the idea of science through stories. So one of the projects that I worked on is called Science Storms. And so the elements as an exhibit developer that I go through and have to work on in order to tell these stories is coming up with the concept, so what is it about? Coming up with what people get to do. So when you walk into the space, what is that experience? What are you doing? What are you seeing? How are you doing that? And then actually producing it. So doing media production, doing fabrication, prototyping things, and testing it with visitors to see what works, what doesn't. And then someday, at the end of that giant process, you end up with really cool, amazing experiences and exhibits that delight and entertain people, and hopefully teach them a little bit of science as well. So let me explain a little bit about the Science Storms exhibit to help sort of illustrate what I mean. So Science Storms, when I came to the museum, it was the first project I worked on, and the museum wanted to update their presentation of basic physics and chemistry. Now, if you tell someone, like, I'm a physicist, the first thing they will say is like, oh God, I hated that class in high school, which pretty much everybody did, second to math. So trying to sort of sucker people into understanding that they're, into an exhibit about physics, and not just any people, but kids, is a bit of a challenge. So to come up with the story of Science Storms, we brought in and had a lot of conversations with different scientists, educators, various folks, and we batted around a couple of ideas. And the kernel of the idea for Science Storms actually came out of a conversation we had over coffee during a break with one of these meetings. So we were talking to some of the scientists who were there, and we got to talking, like asking them about like what it was that got them interested in the science that they were doing. And when we reflected on those conversations, what we realized was that every single one of them had a different story, but at the root of all of it is that they were fascinated by something as a child out in nature. And so the entire story of Science Storms started with that idea that science is inspired by a sense of awe at nature. So it's a totally natural thing to go out and see something like a rainbow and be like, that's cool, how does that work? And so science is this process that happens when you're fascinated by something and you want to try and figure out how that works. So from there, we started to build our story. So this concept board is the result of a very long process where we were like, okay, cool. So natural phenomena, which ones could we choose as sort of poster child for different areas of physics or chemistry? So we talked about tornadoes and getting into gas laws and thermodynamics, fire, getting into chemistry and combustion. So we came up with this series of different phenomena that told that story of science being inspired by a sense of awe at nature. So from there, I got to go out and meet lots of cool people. I went to explosives camp in New Mexico, which was really, really cool. We blew up a car. So I got to learn chemistry. So going out, the next part of my job was developing that content and figuring out within this story, what is the actual science content? Because in a museum, we have the benefit of, like, there's no textbook, there's no test at the end of the day. You get to go have fun, and so you get to pick what that content is that fits the story that you want to tell. So we developed the content. Then we worked with a bunch of really cool designers and figured out, like, what do you get to do? When you walk into the museum, how are you, like, what are you touching? What are you seeing? What are you doing? So we liked this idea, again, going back to our story of science is inspired by a sense of awe. we were like, well, when you walk into the room, you should feel a sense of awe. So we were like, well, we have a giant building, let's make giant things. So we made giant recreation of phenomena. So we have a 4-story indoor tornado, a 20-foot diameter avalanche disk filled with sand. We have a lightning show that goes on in a giant Tesla coil. We have live fire, which is amazing, in Chicago, in a city that burnt to the ground, that they let us put fire inside. So it was great. So coming up with all the ideas of the things that you get to do and what's going to spark people's imagination and show them a good time and have fun while you're doing it. And then from there was the actual production phase. So doing things like taking scientists out of their natural habitat and putting them on green screens in front of a camera and making them talk to you so that that could go into the exhibit, building the things, building a 4-story tornado. And at the end of the process, we ended up with something that looks like this. So we have our 4-story indoor tornado, the avalanche disk. You can create rainbows. This is about 4 stories tall. So we created this amazing experience, and it's every day that I go down there, all of the hard work that went into it, to see one kid having a good time or discovering something for the first time is absolutely worth all the hard work. So this is what I get to do all the time. Another project I worked on is called Numbers in Nature. This one's about math. So if I thought physics was a hard sell, going and talking to people about math and convincing them that was an experience they wanted to have was even more fun. I went down to one of the things that we will do early in a process is go down to the exhibit floor and just have conversations with our guests and ask, I'm thinking of making an exhibit about this. And when I went down and I started out the first time and said, hi, I'm making this exhibit about math, and people could not find the bathroom fast enough, get to the Omnimax theater fast enough. They had zero interest whatsoever. But then we started thinking about patterns. So we're like, well, what if we just put in a giant mirror maze? And if you look at the floor plan of a mirror maze from the top, it's just a giant pattern. And you see recurring patterns in nature all the time, spirals in your ear, in the galaxy, branching in trees, your veins. And then there's this useful thing called math that explains the patterns that you see, and there you go. So come for the mirror maze, and we'll sucker you into staying for the math. So those are the really cool projects that I get to work on all the time. But that's the happy ending. So let's back up a little bit to the beginning of the story. So how I got to the happy ending. So I actually started out in music. I've played violin since I was 5. And I actually went to college. I double majored in physics and music. So I've always played music, but I've also always loved science and math. So I was like the double nerd. I went to orchestra camp and math camp, and they were both amazing. So I couldn't decide between the two, so I went to college in Indiana to DePaul University, where I could double major in both of those, and had a great time. And then when I got to the end of college, I had the same problem. I couldn't decide between following the path and going into a career in music and going into science. And really what won out was the abject fear of being a starving artist my entire life. So I decided, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I still liked this whole physics thing, and the rumor had it that they would pay you to go to school for physics, because nobody else wanted to. With that, which is the worst reasoning ever to go to grad school, so don't do that. But I ended up at the University of Wisconsin up in Madison, where I entered the PhD program for physics. So while I was there, I continued to play music. I played with the University Symphony. I attended a performing arts school as a kid, so I continued to act. I modeled for a little bit. Try telling the folks in the lab that you have to go to your photo shoot, and they think you're really, really weird. And I even taught martial arts for a while. So things were great. I got the PhD. And then, like any good story, we come to the conflict. Because I'd worked so hard, trained so hard to be a researcher, and I felt like this. I just knew in my gut I didn't want to be a researcher. And all of the work I had done and all of the advice I had gotten, is that you train, you do this, you stay in academia and you do research, or you go to industry and you do research. And I knew deep down I didn't want to do either one of those things. That I liked it, but I didn't love it. And 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road, I wasn't going to jump out of bed every morning and get really excited about what I was doing. So this is kind of a problem. So I didn't think I wanted to stay in academia because I thought I hated teaching. So I'm like, well, I guess that means I'm going to start interviewing for industry jobs, because those were the two paths. You have door A or you have door B. There is no door C. So I started interviewing for jobs and got some lovely offers, but I still had this nagging feeling that it really just wasn't for me. And so at the 11th hour, I came across a job listing for a postdoc doing education outreach, which I had never heard of before. But it was also working within the university, but developing activities for students as young as middle school all the way up through college that took ideas about nanotechnology and created curriculum and tabletop demos and various things. And it was the first thing that I read, the first job description that I read that I got excited about, because it brought in a little bit of that creativity, all of the science, and it brought the two together, and I never knew that was possible. So I went to my graduate advisor, and he told me I was throwing my career away, literally in those many words. And I think he was as scared as I was, because he had been brought up in this traditional path as well. He had chosen door A or door B, and that was what he was trained to help me to do. So when I came to him and I said neither one of those fit, he told me he didn't know how he could help me, that he wanted to, he didn't know how, but that I was throwing my research career away if this is what I really wanted to do. So this is where sort of knowing yourself and trusting your gut really becomes important, because I knew that this was for me. So I took the postdoc, and I had a ball. I adored every minute of it. So I got to do fun things with kids, like little tabletop demos talking about light and spectrum, and we put oven mitts on people and made them try to put Legos together to start to talk about how small atoms are. Even made a board game for college kids about the societal impacts of emerging technology. So I was having a grand old time, but some days just still felt like this. Something wasn't quite right. I was enjoying this ability to combine the creative with the science, but I still knew that I had two choices. At some point, my postdoc would be over, and I would have to go through door A or door B and go back to research, because that's what I was trained to do. So, like every good story, there's also now a plot twist. One of my grad students was working for me. She was finishing up her degree and looking for jobs. And she came to me one day, and she had this job description for an exhibit developer at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. And at that point, like everybody else, I was like, this is a thing, this is a job. It's sort of like toy tester. Who does that? Because you don't think about who has to make this stuff at the museum. And so for the second time, I read through a job description, and it's like, oh man, it's like, I could be really good at that. But the problem was, I'd only been in my postdoc for about 8 or 9 months. I loved my postdoc, and I had nothing on the list of requirements for this job at the museum except for a degree in physics. I had never worked in a museum. I had no experience in all the things that they listed. So, and I wasn't looking. I wasn't looking to move. So I took this description to my postdoc advisor, and I got slightly better advice this time. And she told me, if my job is to prepare you for what is next, and you really think this is what's next, then you have to try. And so knowing yourself, and the timing may never be right, you have to take the leap and try it again. So I took a leap, and they hired me. So I was brought on for the Science Storms project, and you know the end of the story already. I get to do amazing, cool projects all the time. And following this path, I have discovered things that I never knew I was interested in. I get to combine the creative and the science, but I discovered a passion for getting other people excited about science that I never knew that I had. I've been able to sort of stretch myself creatively by the different designers and artists and engineers and interesting people that I get to work with. And it really, learning new skills. Turns out I love media production. You get to go and do fun things and interview famous athletes on green screen and throw them in an exhibit. But I love that process. And these are all things that I would never have discovered about myself if I hadn't really pushed myself, trusted my gut, and followed that path. So this quote is used quite a bit, but it is a good reminder for me that the traditional path doesn't always have to be for you. That if you prepare yourself, if you know yourself and trust your gut and take a calculated risk, you may just be able to write your own incredible story. Thank you.